They walked in like they already won. The reporters, the analysts, the cameras, every single person in that room believed they knew exactly how this press conference would go. They thought they had the questions that would corner Trump, the angles that would break Karoline, and the headlines ready before a single word was spoken. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see coming, was that today they weren't setting the trap. Today they were walking into one. Trump adjusted the microphone, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than necessary. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the eager faces, the poised pens, the subtle glances exchanged between journalists. Some were waiting for a stumble, others for a soundbite they could twist into something it wasn't. He smirked. "All right," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the room. "I'm sure you all have some very fair and unbiased questions, right?" A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd. Some reporters shifted in their seats. Others clenched their jaws, already formulating their attacks. Trump didn't flinch. He had seen this before 100 times over. He knew exactly how this was going to go. The first reporter stood up, a woman from CNN, her expression serious, her voice sharp. She had practiced this one. "Mr. Trump, many Americans are concerned that your policies are dangerous for democracy. How do you respond?" It was predictable, the kind of question meant to put him on the defensive before the conversation even began. Trump tilted his head slightly, pretending to think. "Which Americans?" he asked. "The ones watching inflation crush their savings? The ones dealing with record crime in their neighborhoods? Or the ones sitting in this room?" The reporter blinked, caught off guard. That wasn't the answer she was expecting. She recovered quickly. "The concern," she continued, "is that your rhetoric is divisive, that it undermines faith in our institutions." Before Trump could respond, Karoline Leavitt leaned slightly forward, her voice cutting through the air, calm but firm. "What you mean to say," she said, "is that people are tired of being lied to, tired of being told their struggles aren't real, tired of being fed narratives that don't match what they see with their own eyes." A few journalists exchanged glances. Cameras zoomed in. This wasn't the response they had planned for. Karoline continued, unwavering. "People don't distrust institutions because of rhetoric. They distrust them because those institutions have failed them over and over again." The weight of her words settled over the room. There was a brief hesitation before another reporter jumped in, his voice louder, more aggressive. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, adjusting his glasses, "are you suggesting that journalists shouldn't question those in power? That the press should just accept whatever politicians tell them?" It was another trap, an attempt to make her look like she was attacking free press itself. Karoline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile on her lips. "No," she said simply. "I'm saying journalists should do their jobs." The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable. A few reporters sat a little straighter, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. The air felt different now. They weren't dictating this conversation. They were reacting to it. Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, you should write that down." The man with the glasses pressed forward, unwilling to let the moment slip. "So you believe the media is the enemy of the people?" That was it. The headline they were waiting for. The soundbite they could run all day long. Karoline didn't give it to them. "I believe the media should hold power accountable," she said, her voice steady. "But when reporters stop asking real questions and start manufacturing stories, they aren't journalists. They're activists with press badges." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some cameras zoomed in again, looking for any flicker of doubt, any hesitation they could seize on. But there was none. The reporter in glasses opened his mouth to fire back. But before he could, another voice cut in, sharper, more impatient. The real attack was about to begin. The man in the second row adjusted his tie, trying to keep his expression neutral, but his voice carried a sharp edge. "So, are you saying journalists shouldn't question authority?" It was a carefully crafted question, the kind designed to paint her as someone who wanted a free pass, who couldn't handle scrutiny. A classic move: twist the conversation, force a defensive response. Karoline didn't hesitate. "No," she said plainly. "I'm saying journalists should do their jobs." The words landed harder than expected. A few reporters exchanged quick glances. Some shifted in their seats, as if suddenly uncomfortable. Trump chuckled. "Yeah, you might want to write that down." The reporter wasn't ready to let it go. He leaned forward, determined to get the answer he wanted. "So, then, do you believe the media is the enemy of the people?" There it was. The headline they had been waiting for. The phrase they needed to clip, frame, and run on every major network by nightfall. Karoline didn't blink. "I believe the media should hold power accountable," she said, her voice steady. "But when reporters stop asking real questions and start creating stories, they aren't journalists anymore. They're activists with press badges." A murmur spread through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just beneath the surface. Some reporters glanced at their notes, others at their cameras. The ones who had come in expecting an easy hit piece were now scrambling to adjust. The man in glasses cleared his throat. His confidence wavered, but he pushed forward. "Are you saying conservative media has never spread misinformation? That outlets like Fox News don't have their own bias?" Karoline didn't let him trap her. "I'm saying when CNN spent years pushing the Russia hoax and then quietly admitted it wasn't true, that wasn't journalism. That was election interference. When major outlets buried the Hunter Biden laptop story until it no longer mattered, that wasn't reporting. That was protecting a candidate." The murmurs grew louder. Cameras zoomed in, trying to catch any hesitation, any flicker of doubt. But there was none. The journalist pressed again. "So, just to be clear, you're saying only left-leaning media has an agenda?" Karoline exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I'm saying if you care about truth, you should hold everyone accountable. But that's not what happens. The media only seems to care about disinformation when it challenges their preferred narrative." A few reporters glanced at each other. They knew exactly what she meant. Trump leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium. His voice was casual, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "I remember when the media used to challenge people in power," he said. "But now, if a Democrat says the sky is green, you all print it like fact. If we say it's blue, you call it misinformation." A nervous laugh rippled through the room, but no one argued. Another reporter, a woman in a crisp navy suit, jumped in, trying to regain control. "Mr. Trump, you've repeatedly attacked the press. Don't you think this kind of rhetoric fuels distrust in journalism?" Trump shrugged. "I don't make people distrust the media. You all do that yourselves." She frowned, flipping through her notes. "Are you denying that your own statements contribute to this growing hostility toward the press?" Trump raised an eyebrow. "Did I tell CNN to push a fake collusion story for 4 years? Did I tell the New York Times to bury a major political scandal? Did I force MSNBC to label every Republican as a threat to democracy? No? Then don't blame me for the mess you created." The woman's lips pressed together in a thin line. She had no response, but before she could recover, Karoline stepped in again. "You don't have a problem with politicians lying," she said, scanning the room. "You have a problem with politicians you can't control." The tension in the room thickened. The press had walked in believing they were in charge of the conversation. Now they were on the defensive. A younger reporter in the front row, barely out of his 20s, leaned forward, gripping his notepad like a lifeline. "Ms. Leavitt, you keep talking about media bias, but aren't you just deflecting? If things were as great under Trump as you claim, wouldn't the facts speak for themselves?" Karoline turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Oh, the facts do speak for themselves," she said. "You just don't like what they say." The young journalist blinked, caught off guard. Karoline didn't let the silence linger. "Let's talk about facts," she continued. "Under President Trump, unemployment hit record lows. Wages went up. Energy independence was within reach. That's not opinion, that's data." She took a small step forward, just enough to let the weight of her words settle. "Now we have inflation hammering families, crime surging in major cities, and a border crisis completely out of control. Those are facts. But instead of holding this administration accountable, you're here trying to score points." The young reporter opened his mouth, ready to push back, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You don't want facts," she said, her voice unwavering. "You want sound bites. You want something you can clip, spin, and turn into a headline that fits your narrative." A few gasps from the crowd. Some reporters glanced at each other, fingers hovering over keyboards, deciding how to frame this. But the power had shifted, and they knew it. The tension in the room thickened. The reporters, realizing they were losing control of the conversation, adjusted their strategy. They wouldn't retreat. They would push harder. A man in the second row, wearing thick glasses and a tailored suit, leaned forward. His smirk was barely concealed as he aimed his next shot. "So, are you saying conservative media is always honest?" It was meant to corner Karoline, force her into either defending all right-wing outlets or admitting that bias wasn't exclusive to one side. She didn't hesitate. "I'm saying when CNN spent 4 years pushing a fake Russia collusion story and quietly walked it back when it no longer mattered, that wasn't journalism. That was election interference." The shift in the air was immediate. Some reporters stiffened. Others avoided eye contact. No one wanted to address it, but they knew exactly what she meant. The man with the glasses cleared his throat. "So, by your logic, misinformation only comes from the left?" Karoline's voice remained calm. "By my logic, journalists should be honest, no matter who it benefits. But that's not what happens. When a Democrat is in office, you downplay failures, rewrite history, and call anyone who questions it a conspiracy theorist." Before he could respond, Trump leaned into the microphone, resting his hands on the podium. "You spent years calling me an illegitimate president," he said, shaking his head. "Every night, every headline, every panel discussion, you pushed a hoax. But when Democrats question elections, suddenly it's about protecting democracy." A female reporter near the front row spoke up, her voice sharp. "Mr. Trump, with all due respect, your claims about election fraud have been widely debunked." Trump smirked. "By who? The same people who swore the Hunter Biden laptop was fake? The same networks that called inflation transitory, while Americans watched their grocery bills double?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could fire back, Karoline stepped in again. "You don't investigate," she said. "You decide what's true based on what benefits your narrative. And when the facts don't fit, you bury them." A few reporters in the back exchanged glances. Some typed notes furiously, others whispered into their earpieces, likely getting instructions on how to spin this in real time. A younger journalist, barely out of his 20s, adjusted his tie and jumped in, his voice dripping with skepticism. "If Trump's policies were as great as you claim, why would the media need to twist anything? Wouldn't the results speak for themselves?" Karoline didn't blink. "Oh, they do," she said. "The problem is you don't report them." The reporter scoffed. "So now the press is responsible for people's perceptions?" Karoline tilted her head. "When you spend 4 years telling Americans their eyes are lying to them, don't act surprised when they stop trusting you." Trump chuckled. "Exactly. We had record-low unemployment, rising wages, and energy independence, and you all still found a way to make it sound like the world was ending. Now we've got inflation, crime surging, a border crisis, and you pretend everything's fine." The young journalist opened his mouth, but Trump cut him off. No, I know what you're gonna do. You'll take one line, rip it out of context, slap a headline on it, and pretend it means something else." A murmur ran through the room. The real battle wasn't about facts. It was about control, and the press was losing. A veteran reporter in the front row, dressed in a navy blazer, cleared her throat. She had been waiting for her moment. Her voice was measured but firm, designed to sound neutral while setting up the perfect trap. "Mr. Trump, will you accept the results of the 2024 election, no matter the outcome?" The room stilled. The question was familiar, one they had thrown at him countless times before. It was never asked as a genuine inquiry. It was a loaded weapon, designed to corner him. Trump didn't flinch. He didn't shift or hesitate. Instead, he leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the journalist. "I'll accept a fair election," he said smoothly. "Will you?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed the reporter's face. It was barely noticeable, just a fraction of a second, but Karoline caught it. The hesitation, because she knew, and the journalist knew, that the same people now demanding Trump pledge unconditional acceptance had spent 4 years refusing to accept 2016. They had called it stolen, rigged, interfered with. They had built entire narratives around delegitimizing his presidency. And now, when the tables were turned, they expected blind obedience. Silence stretched across the room. Karoline saw the opening and took it. "You called Trump illegitimate for years," she said, her voice steady. "You platformed conspiracy theories about Russian interference, broken voting machines, stolen ballots. But when the other side raises concerns, suddenly questioning elections is an attack on democracy." A low murmur ran through the press corps. Some reporters fidgeted, others looked down at their notes. One journalist shifted in his seat, clearing his throat like he wanted to jump in. But he didn't. The usual confidence, the usual quick rebuttals, they weren't there. For the first time in a long time, the press had no immediate answer. They had walked into this press conference prepared to control the discussion, to steer the headlines before they were even written. But now, they weren't leading the conversation. They were trying to keep up. A heavy silence hung in the air. The usual flurry of rapid-fire questions. The frantic rush to control the narrative. It wasn't there. Reporters glanced at each other, some gripping their pens tightly, others staring at their notes as if searching for a way to recover. In the back of the room, a cameraman whispered something to his colleague. A producer's voice crackled through an earpiece, urgently instructing a journalist to pivot, to salvage what they could. But there was no saving this. Social media was already ablaze. Clips from the press conference, unfiltered and unedited, were spreading at lightning speed. The usual networks hadn't even had time to put their spin on it. And yet, the people watching at home already knew exactly what had happened. Trump shook his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked across the room at the faces now filled with quiet frustration. "You people never learn," he said, almost amused. A gray-haired journalist in the back took his chance, raising his voice in a last-ditch effort to regain control. "But, Mr. Trump, isn't it fair to say you thrive on controversy? That this back and forth with the media actually benefits you?" Trump didn't hesitate. "I don't make you lie," he said. "I don't tell you to cover for corruption. That's on you." The reporter opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was no comeback that wouldn't prove Trump's point. Karoline took a step forward, scanning the room one last time. She wasn't smiling, but there was a certainty in her eyes. "The saddest part?" she said. "Journalism used to mean something. Now it's just a joke." No one responded. No one could. The press, so used to setting the tone, found themselves without words. Trump gave a small nod. Karoline turned from the podium. And just like that, it was over. Trump adjusted his cuff as he stepped back from the podium. Karoline didn't look around. She didn't need to. The silence behind them told her everything. The reporters weren't firing off last-minute questions. There was no desperate attempt to regain control. They had nothing left. The cameras were still rolling, but instead of framing their usual dramatic shots, they captured something the press wasn't used to. A room full of journalists sitting in quiet frustration. Their pens rested on their notepads, their expressions a mix of disbelief and irritation. Trump and Karoline walked toward the exit, unbothered, the weight of the press conference still lingering in the air behind them. The doors swung open, and suddenly, the silence was replaced by a surge of sound. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Supporters who had been watching live on their phones were waiting, their energy electric. The second Trump and Karoline stepped out, the noise exploded. Cheers, applause, voices calling their names. Karoline glanced at Trump, who shook his head with a knowing smirk. "They didn't see that coming," he said. "No," she agreed, exhaling slowly. "They didn't." But before they could reach their cars, a voice cut through the air. "Ms. Leavitt, Mr. Trump." A reporter in a navy blazer rushed toward them, microphone in hand, her camera crew scrambling to keep up. She was from one of the major networks, and she looked desperate, like someone who had just been ordered to salvage a sinking ship. Trump barely glanced at her. "No thanks." She ignored him, pressing forward. "Do you stand by everything you said today?" Karoline stopped. She turned, locking eyes with the journalist. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Find one thing I said that wasn't true." The woman opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because she couldn't. Not in real time. Not without twisting something into a lie. Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "See? That's the problem. They don't argue facts. They just change the subject." The crowd erupted again, drowning out whatever weak response the reporter had been about to mumble. Karoline turned away, stepping toward the waiting cars. The noise swelled, voices blending into one unstoppable wave of momentum. Trump raised a hand in acknowledgement, his smirk never fading. And just like that, they were gone.